Today, we will discover the top 3 most powerful opening traps in the King's Indian defense, one of the most popular chess openings of all time. So, let's jump right into it and get started. The King's Indian defense begins when black responds with a kingside fianchetto setup against white's moves such as pawn to d4, pawn to c4, or knight to f3. For example, in the most common opening sequence, white starts with pawn to e4 to claim control of the center. Black replies with pawn to d6 to reinforce that square, and we reach the main line of the King's Indian defense. Here, white continues developing, but one common mistake is playing bishop to d3. At first glance, this move looks perfectly natural, but it actually violates a key principle of the King's Indian defense. One of black's main strategic ideas is to put pressure on the pawn at d4 using the fianchettoed bishop on g7. You can increase that pressure further by developing your knight to c6. Another powerful idea is to bring your bishop to g4, targeting the knight on f3, or to break in the center with pawn to e5. As you can see, black has several dynamic ways to attack white's central pawn on d4. By placing the bishop on d3, white blocks the queen's protection of that pawn, leaving it vulnerable, making this move positionally flawed. At this stage, white often doesn't realize the danger, but will stick to our plan and continue with bishop to g4, aiming to exchange the defender of the center. This setup makes it much easier for us to target white's pawn on d4 later. Typically, white responds with pawn to h3, trying to chase away our bishop. We calmly exchange bishops and then play knight to c6, immediately increasing pressure on the d4 pawn. This is one of the simplest and most effective plans in the King's Indian defense, which is why I really like it. So, what can white do here? In most cases, they'll try to defend their center. If they decide to push the pawn forward, we'll discuss that in a moment. But one strong option for black is knight to a5, creating a fork between the queen and the bishop. However, an even better idea is to position your knight on d4, a dominant square where it can be supported later by your pawns. In most situations, white prefers to maintain their pawn chain, playing bishop to a3 to reinforce the center. We continue logically with knight to d7, opening up the diagonal for our dark squared bishop while renewing pressure on the d4 pawn. Now, if white tries to defend it once again, there's a very interesting tactical idea for black. In this particular game, where white was rated around 2,200 and black around 2,400, played in classical time control, black missed a powerful shot, knight to e5. At first, it seems like this move simply sacrifices the knight, but it's actually a brilliant fork on the queen and bishop. After pawn takes knight on a5, black plays knight to a5, repeating the same fork idea. This time, the queen must move, and after that, knight takes d3 completely wins the game. If the queen moves to f4, black can even finish the game instantly with a royal fork, attacking both the king and the queen at once. If white plays queen to g3, it's slightly better, but black is still winning. After knight to d3 check, you can capture the other pawn and continue threatening more weaknesses. For example, you can play pawn to c5, followed by queen to a 5 check, and it becomes very easy for black to convert the advantage from there. Now, let's return to the main line of the King's Indian defense. As we discussed earlier, the move bishop to d3 is actually a mistake. The correct and most common move is bishop to e2, and here we still follow the same strategic plan. We begin with bishop to g4, aiming to eliminate the knight on f3, a key defender of the center. After white castles kingside, we play a clever move, knight from f6 to d7. While this isn't the main theoretical line, I really like it for its simplicity and clarity. It allows black to continue building steady pressure on the pawn at d4. Sooner or later, white will usually play pawn to h3, trying to challenge the bishop, but we don't mind that at all. We intended to trade there eventually. Once the exchange happens, we continue with knight to c6, now attacking the pawn on d4 twice. At this point, white must react. If they defend the pawn, it's harder for us to increase pressure since their queen now protects it. That's why it was beneficial for us earlier when the queen didn't defend the d4 pawn. Still, black can immediately strike back in the center with pawn to a5, seizing control over the key central squares. If white tries to push forward, black doesn't retreat. Instead, we advance with knight to d4, placing the knight right in the heart of white's position, an extremely powerful and uncomfortable post that dominates the board. From this position, black controls an impressive number of key squares. Even better, we can reinforce our knight in the center by supporting it with another pawn after playing pawn to c5. At some point, white will likely decide to capture the knight, but that actually benefits us. After the exchange, we end up with a strong pawn on d4, which pushes the knight away and simultaneously opens the diagonal for our dark squared bishop. Once the white knight retreats, there are a few powerful continuations for black. One solid option is to defend the pawn by playing queen to f6, but there's an even more creative and tricky idea, pawn to d3. This move opens up the diagonal for the bishop, and if white captures, we respond with bishop takes b2, attacking the rook. When white moves the rook, it seems at first like they've outplayed us, since our bishop has to retreat and they can potentially capture the pawn on b7. However, that's exactly where the trap lies. After knight to c5, we deliver a fork on the queen and rook, winning the game instantly. And even if white avoids this trap, black still enjoys a superior position, thanks to the dominant bishop and a powerful knight on c5, both perfectly placed to control the center and pressure the opponent's position. Everything looks great so far. But what happens if you're facing a strong and experienced opponent who understands the king's Indian defense well and knows exactly what you're trying to do? In that case, white will do everything possible to reinforce the pawn on d4. They might start with pawn to h3, preventing you from developing your bishop to g4, and then continue with bishop to e3 to strengthen the center. When you develop your knight, they'll respond with knight to f3, thinking they've fully secured control over d4. At this point, white might feel confident, believing there's no way for you to break through. But here comes your key counterstrike. Pawn to a5, directly challenging the center. If white allows you to capture on d4, that's fantastic. You'll open both the diagonal for your bishop and the e-file for your rook, giving you powerful activity. However, in most games, white will push forward with pawn to d5, expecting your knight to retreat. But instead of moving back, you boldly play knight to d4. At first glance, it looks like a mistake. White can simply capture on d4 and win a pawn, or so they think. But then comes the tactical explosion. Knight takes e4. You immediately exploit white's lack of development and the fact that their king is still in the center, creating massive threats along the e-file. The follow-up is both beautiful and rare. After knight takes e4, you continue with queen to h4. While it may not win outright, it gives black an incredibly strong position. The move combines a pin along the fourth rank with the pressure on the e-file, creating a web of threats that's extremely difficult for white to untangle. If white moves away, you'll win the bishop on d4 since it's attacked twice. If white tries to trade pieces, don't rush to recapture. Instead, insert an in-between check, capturing a knight with check. The queen must then block, leading to an approximately equal endgame, though many players instinctively block with the bishop, planning to castle. That's when you strike again. Rather than taking the bishop, play queen takes g2, attacking the rook. You'll capture the rook with check, and only afterward safely recover your bishop, leaving white's position completely shattered. If white instead captures on g7, you have another clever resource. Rook to e8, setting up a discovered check. Should white move the bishop, knight takes c3 attacks the queen while checking the king, forcing white to lose the queen and the game. To avoid this, white might retreat with bishop to e2, but then you simply capture on g7, destroying their center and activating all your pieces. Even if white tries queen to d4, you can easily defend and trade, leaving white with a ruined pawn structure. Although the position may be objectively equal, black is the one pressing, your rooks are active, your king is safe, and you can later continue with bishop to d7 and rook to e8 for a dominant setup. Thanks for watching.